I'll give some examples of some of the legislation that we passed that kind of points in that direction. But before I do, I want to, well, first give you a little bit of insider baseball and then external baseball. So many of you probably don't know that this was actually a very successful session for us in the Oregon Senate in terms of building bipartisan relations. I don't know if that story has been told. You may remember, those of you who follow this stuff, that we had a very rough short session last time, 2016, in terms of the family relations between the Republicans and the Democrats. And it was really much better this session, much more productive. And I will use myself as a personal example of that. At the end of that short session, relations between me and my good Republican colleague, Fred Girod from Staten, were so bad that Fred, he moved his desk to the other side of the chamber. And then this session, we partnered on two very important pieces of legislation, and I'll talk about one of them. And I think that was kind of emblematic of, I think we all looked, at the end of that session, we were all so frustrated and so miserable that we were kind of looking at the abyss, and we didn't want to spend another session there. So it's an interesting thing. I'd be happy to, in private, give you more of the dirty details. So much of this work really is about relationships, and often when we throw around terms like the urban-rural divide, they really are belied when you bring things down to a human sort of level. Now, I'm the chair of the Environment and Natural Resources Committee, so, I live in a very schizophrenic kind of relationship. I mean, you have environment and priorities, as Melissa mentioned, for conservation and environmental quality of life, et cetera, and also use and development of our natural resources. And, we find collisions around that happening all the time. But I myself, representing an urban district where my constituency is really, for the most part, kind of ignorant about the natural resources side of what we do as a state, and very committed to the environmental side of what we do. I often find myself in a role, because I'm chairing the Environment and Natural Resource Committee, of having to be the explainer to them of what a statewide perspective means. And actually, I think that's something that all our colleagues do. Those who represent rural areas are, often in a position where they understand and need to interpret for their constituencies the needs of people in the urban area. I think, very often the way to get beyond these stereotypes about urban-rural divide is just bringing people together and, sort of to see the world through each other's eyes. And I had the good fortune when I first became, so I was appointed into the position as chair back in the end of 2013 and then for the 2014 session because I stepped over from the House to the Senate right.
Down.
So I inherited my predecessor's assignment, and one of the first things that I did after getting that assignment was, one of the members of my committee at the time was Senator Bill Hansel from Eastern Oregon, great guy, and he invited me out to his district to spend a couple of days just to kind of see things firsthand. And it was really, I have to say, really eye-opening for me to spend time at the Port of Morrow and to see some of the really exciting economic development that was happening in that part of the state on the Columbia River. and onto the Umatilla Reservation, and just meeting with people, seeing the the growth in high-value agriculture, but of course the challenges that they faced by not having enough water or a reliable, stable water source. And so I really, I learned a lot, and last night that I was there was a gathering of local people, and there was, I hadn't anticipated that I was going to get grilled by all these local people, and I was Mr. Urban Oregon, on the receiving end of a lot of questions. But one of the questions was actually specifically about the urban-rural divide, and it was, so how do we get people in Portland to understand the world as we live it? And I had no idea how to answer that, but I quickly, thinking on my feet, I said, well, every month in my district I have a constituent coffee, which is something I've done for many years. And we have 20, 30 people come together, sit around a table, drink coffee, talk about issues. And why don't some of you come out to one of these coffees and meet my constituents? And they said, that is a great idea. And we did that. And ever since then, we've been kind of going back and forth. Just last year, got a couple of vans and took people from my district back out to Eastern Oregon. We visited 3 Mile Canyon, which is a big dairy farm. We went on to the Umatilla Reservation. We met with people. And I have to say it was really eye-opening for my people. And the same thing happened when people from Hansel's district came over to my coffee and really explained why they need water, and just we had a really, really interesting exchange. And one of the things that I realized was in that meeting, I would say half the people who were at that meeting had roots in Eastern Oregon. Either they had come from Eastern Oregon, or they had close family connections in Eastern Oregon. And so they knew how to see the world through rural eyes, although they were now living in an urban world. And those are the kinds of things I think that we really need to build on. Those kinds of exchanges, those kinds of interactions, and we realize that some of those sort of polarized stereotypes kind of fall away. Now let me just very quickly mention a few of the bills that we passed this session that I think kind of exemplify that. You've heard already, you heard Kathy McEwen this morning talk about the big transportation package that we passed. And what's interesting is of the 4 co-chairs of the group that steered that legislation, none of them was from Portland. 3 of them were from rural parts of the state. Only one, Lee Beyer from Springfield, was from an urban area. And I think they really came up with a program that did look statewide. But one of the interesting things that they heard as they took their road shows around the state was concern in the rural parts of the state about traffic problems in Portland, in the Portland area, because they had to get their goods to market, they had to get their goods to the port, and they were getting stalled in Portland. So the idea that people we often hear, we in urban Oregon, hear about the need to support rural Oregon. And I think when it's really explained to people, they do. But here it was kind of the reverse, that rural people really having a stake in transportation issues in Portland. And I thought that was really very interesting. We, as you heard, one of the accomplishments of the session is, at least for now, we seem to be on track to keep the Elliott State Forest public. And what was really noteworthy about that is, as you can imagine, that was a big issue for people in my district. You know, people who are environmentalists, they want to keep the Elliott public. But what was really interesting about the session was hearing how strong the support for that was from people in Melissa's area down in Coos Bay, adjacent to the Elliott, that finding a path to keeping the Elliott public was really important to them. And believe me, that made our work a lot easier this session, both in creating the legislation to make trust land transfers possible, and then to come up with the initial funding to help with that. One of the bills that I mentioned earlier that I partnered with Senator Girard on is opening up mining resources in frontier Oregon. And this, I think, was it was a very interesting process that lasted much of the session. We started early in the session. Fred and I partnered on a bill that regulates suction dredge mining, in the in-stream mining in the state to make sure it doesn't happen in areas where there's vulnerable fish, endangered species habitat. But through that work, that led to our working together on how to exploit what are potentially very significant resources in frontier Oregon, an area that's very challenged economically, and where there seems to be a potential for significant resources kind of coming up from Nevada, that same sort of area. How can we do that in a way that is environmentally responsible, but where all of the environmental and public health I's and T's are dotted and crossed, but doing it in a more streamlined manner so that the permitting can all happen in a consolidated upfront manner in which there are assurances that things like sage-grouse habitat is respected, and things that need to be done. And at the end of the day, I think we ended up with something that really has a lot of potential, and it ended up getting really broad bipartisan support at the end of the session. Finally, let me just say that one of the pieces of unfinished business but ongoing work, as many of you know, is looking at developing a carbon pricing program for Oregon, something along the lines of cap and invest. And many of us are committed to working on this, certainly because we understand the challenges of climate change, and to be honest, the extreme consequences for rural Oregon of the effects of climate change. But the challenge of how to do it in a way that actually builds Oregon's economy, particularly rural economies, in terms of investments in alternative energy sources, which, going back to that Morrow miracle that I learned about in my first trip into Hansel's district, a lot of that miracle is due to investments in alternative energy. So how do we do that in a way that is actually good for Oregon's economy, and particularly its rural economy, through the use of direct investments and also offsets? The Warm Springs have already been the beneficiaries of offsets through the California program. We should be using Oregon resources to be able to invest in those strategies as well. The thing is, none of that can happen if people in Salem design a program without direct involvement of people from our rural communities. And so as we pursue this, and we're going to be working on it over the next few months, We are going to be looking at it in terms of a number of different focuses. One directly on agriculture and forestry and rural economies. And we want to make sure that we have people from the rural areas directly involved in that, including from the tribes. Utilities, energy-intensive industries, impacted communities, communities of color, and those who are really going to be challenged if we do this, who are challenged by climate change, but who could potentially be really harmed if we do this wrong, right? Because people in rural areas are very dependent on energy. I mean, they tend to drive longer distances. They may have more extreme kinds of weather that they're living in. If we do this in a way that's just going to increase their costs, that is going to be a real mistake. So again, the answer to this is going to be getting people together, seeing the challenges through one another's eyes, and doing the hard work. And I think that's what we're committed to doing. Thank you.